Welcome to Weird PVD, the podcast. Every week, your host, Sherry Kasperzak, takes you to the odd corners of beautiful Providence, Rhode Island. From big blue bugs to unique art, from weird history to weird food, you'll never look at Rhode Island's creative capital the same again. Tune in every Weird Wednesday. So, riddle me this, PVD weirdos. If Rhode Island is the smallest state, does that mean you're even less likely to be killed by a serial killer than the average American? Your chances of being murdered by a serial killer are less than 4 in 1 million, so very low. In fact, you're more likely to die choking on a New York system wiener than you are to be slain by a serial killer. And even though it's highly unlikely you'll meet your demise by being serially murdered, there's not a zero chance of that happening, even in the smallest state in the country. Today on Weird PVD, the podcast, we'll talk about 3 serial killers who terrorized the Ocean State. And as we are left wondering about the existence of a brand new New England serial killer, just how safe are we? And I want to warn our listeners today. Today's episode contains graphic descriptions of violence and references to sex work, so listener discretion is advised, and please take care. In the summer of 1984, a monster roamed Providence, robbing 3 women of their lives and brutally assaulting a teenage girl. This monster operated in a 5-block radius near a bus station he frequented. And if it hadn't been for an epic blunder, an oversight so stupid it's breathtaking, who knows how many more victims he could have claimed. I always love stupid criminals. On June 26, 1984, the body of Lori Carlucci, a 22-year-old sex worker, was discovered at a construction site in downtown Providence. A bloody towel that was embroidered with a name was discovered beneath Lori's body, and this would eventually lead to her killer. Unfortunately, it would also take 2 more murders and a vicious attack for this absolute monster to be taken down. About 6 weeks after Lori's body was discovered, the body of Wanda Sue Adams, an 18-year-old aspiring gospel singer and model, was discovered floating in the Woonasquatucket River. Wanda Sue, a Providence native, had been living in Columbia, South Carolina, but she'd been in town just to visit relatives. Just 2 weeks later, Dolores Nusser, age 58, was found deceased in a downtown parking garage stairwell. On the surface, none of these victims have anything in common. It's hard to tell what motivated the slayings, but all of the victims were found either without pants or with their pants pulled down. All were strangled to death. In September of 1984, 14-year-old Carrie Ann Talbot, a Pawtucket girl who'd run away from a Woonsocket shelter, found herself in Roger Williams Park, smoking marijuana with a man she'd been introduced to by an acquaintance. Out of nowhere, this man, whom she knew as Ray, attacked her, sexually assaulted her, and beat her so savagely, he ended up stomping on her eye and blinding her. She was left for dead in the park. Carrie Ann, thankfully, survived her attack. She was able to tell the police who did these unspeakable things to her. It was a man she knew as Ray, a local pimp who had hung out at the local bus station. Raymond Lessor, a drifter who was reportedly a sex worker, was arrested for this sexual assault, and while he was being questioned by police, he mentioned the name of a man he'd been living with for a while in Pawtucket. It was the same name that was embroidered on the bloodied towel that was found beneath Lori Carlucci's body. It was this that linked him to her murder. Lessor went on to confess to all three murders and the sexual assault of Carrie Ann Talbot. Lessor's motivations aren't completely clear. He reportedly told investigators why he committed these absolutely atrocious crimes, but that information has never been released to the public. What we do know is that Lessor was married and had recently become estranged from his wife, with whom he had an infant daughter. He was described by family and acquaintances as an angry man. As a young person, he was a frequent runaway, and Lessor reportedly moved from foster home to foster home, growing more and more resentful into his adulthood. Lessor was charged with first-degree murder in the slayings of Lori Carlucci, Dolores Neusser, and Wanda Sue Adams. He was also charged with the attempted murder and rape of Carrie Ann Talbot. He is currently spending the rest of his rotten, despicable life in prison. Craig Price was a 13-year-old boy when he committed his first murder, making him the youngest serial killer in U.S. history. The motivations for his crimes appear to be rooted in racial slurs white people shouted at him when he was a young child. These racist people, according to his account, also tried to run over him with their car, which, of course, this is absolutely horrifying. But I can't imagine anything that would compel someone to commit the absolutely heinous murders Price committed. All of Price's crimes seem to be linked by convenience. All of the people he killed lived in his neighborhood. On July 27, 1987, Price, then 13 years old, broke into the home of 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer, took a knife from her kitchen, and stabbed her 58 times. 2 years later, in September of 1989, he broke into the Warwick home of 39-year-old Joan Heaton, a widow who was raising her two daughters, Melissa and Jennifer, on her own. Price stabbed Joan 57 times as 10-year-old Jennifer watched. Then he stabbed Jennifer 60 times and smashed 7-year-old Melissa over the head with a kitchen stool before stabbing her 30 times in an attack so violent that the blade became stuck in the young girl's neck. Possibly the worst thing of all, the bodies of the Heaton family were discovered by Joan Heaton's mother and sister after she hadn't been heard from over the Labor Day weekend. I can't even imagine walking in and finding my family that way. Price was arrested a short time later, and after his arrest for the Heaton murders, he was also charged with the murder of Rebecca Spencer. After he was convicted of the murders, he spent time in a juvenile detention facility until he turned 18. It's important to note that Price was denied parole in 2009, and his original release date was scheduled for 2020. However, a bunch of things have happened in the interim that have kept him in prison. In July of 2009, Price was involved in a fight with another inmate at a Florida correctional facility that resulted in a correctional officer being stabbed in the finger. He was transferred to another Florida correctional facility after that incident. And in 2017, Price was accused of stabbing a fellow inmate with a 5-inch homemade knife. Now, he was sentenced to 25 years for that crime. So thankfully, he remains in prison, and here's hoping he stays there for a very long time. This person obviously has a lot of violent tendencies, and I can't imagine him ever getting out of jail. That would be a terrifying thing. The last killer on our list is probably also the most well known Rhode Island serial killer, but he's also the most unlikely. Jeffrey Mailhot was a 33-year-old who lived a pretty normal life by all accounts. He had an ordinary job and he loved motorcycles and 80s rock and roll. In fact, Mailhot had never even gotten a traffic ticket. And much like with Raymond Lasser, it was a stupid slip up that led to his downfall. It's hard to say exactly when Mailhot began taking sex workers back to his home on Cato Street in Woonsocket, but between 2003 and 2004, things spiraled out of control. By 2004, when he was picked up by police, he'd allegedly picked up about 30 sex workers. The vast majority of these women escaped his bizarre chokehold, a move he'd employ on them to subdue them. A couple of women lost consciousness and beat a hasty retreat once they came around. In 2003, Mailhut picked up a 35-year-old woman named Audrey Harris, intending to pay her for sex. Instead, he ended up choking her until she lost consciousness. Once she was knocked out, he suffocated her with a pillow. Then he spent 2 days with her body in his bathtub before he dismembered her with a handsaw and put her in trash bags. More than a year later, Mailhot picked up Christine Dumont, 42, and just 2 months later, Stacy Goulet came back to his apartment. Goulet was a 25-year-old pregnant mother of two who disappeared after a fireworks display on July 3rd, 2004. Both women were strangled to death, both women were dismembered and tossed into garbage bags. The saddest part of all of this to me is that these women were tossed away like they didn't matter. However, these women decided to make their money, it's none of our business. They were still human beings. They had people who loved them. They still have people who miss them to this day and who remember them fondly. And I'm going to get on a little soapbox. I think that's the way society and maybe even law enforcement treat sex workers who are murdered. There's definitely not as much incentive or urgency to solve a murder of a sex worker as there is to solve the murder of a middle class wife and mother. In his confession to police, Mailhot suggested killing these women was, quote, doing them a favor because they were just killing themselves anyway, end quote. Absolutely disgusting. So here's where Mailhot gave himself away and eventually had no choice but to confess to these horrific crimes. And it's baffling why he decided to open his mouth and be so stupid, but we're glad he did because now he is where he belongs in prison. So it all started in July of 2004 when a woman named Jocelyn Martel, who was in a detention center awaiting trial for drug and prostitution charges, had quite the story to tell police. She told them Mailhut had brought her back to his apartment to pay her for sex, but then he attacked her. She was thankfully able to overpower her attacker and she escaped, like dozens of other people who had been brought back to his apartment. When police brought Mailhot in for questioning on the attack, they asked him about the three missing women in Woonsocket: Audrey Harris, Christine Dumont, and Stacy Goulet. And Mailhot told the police that he had nothing to do with their disappearance because he'd never killed anyone. This is where the dumbs, okay? This is the dumbest thing ever. There's one problem. No one had ever said the three women were dead. At this point, they were all just missing. And now Mailhot was trapped. Over the years, Mailhot told police he'd brought dozens of sex workers back to his apartment on Cato Street. Mailhot, who is just 5'3", but is fairly muscular from years of weightlifting, said that he had mixed results when it came to attacking the sex workers he brought home. Some were able to overpower him and run off. One, Mailhot told police, had actually gouged his eyes before she made her escape. Given the number of women he'd brought back to his apartment uh, for sex, it's truly amazing that the number of victims that he had was as low as it is. Mailhot told police that 10 to 12 women had survived his attacks. And still, when Mailhot was arrested, no one who knew him believed he was capable of the crimes he'd been charged with. His landlord even yelled at the police to leave him alone. A former girlfriend recalled that he'd occasionally engaged in choking during sex, but it had all been consensual, and she couldn't imagine he'd hurt other people. Even so, she did recall that Mailhot told her he couldn't be in a relationship with her and that he would have to stay alone for the rest of his life. In 2006, Mailhot was sentenced to life in prison, and he is still serving his sentence at the Adult Correctional Institute in Cranston, Rhode Island. Thank God. And yeah, so these people are all absolute trash. I think we can all agree on that. I hope that there is not another New England serial killer roaming the grounds in our midst. From everything that I've read and seen, and if you haven't heard about the New England serial killer that's allegedly roaming this region, you can look up a lot of information about it. There are tons of videos that a lot of true crime folks have done. I'm not personally a true crime podcaster. This isn't a true crime podcast, but it is a Rhode Island based podcast. So I wanted to do something about these victims, not about the people who took away their lives. I think it's important to highlight people who lost their lives and people who didn't deserve to die that way. So anyway, thank you as always for joining me on this episode of Weird PVD, the podcast. If you like this episode, could you do me a massive favor? Could you hit the like button? Would you please consider subscribing to YouTube, following me on Apple Podcast or on Spotify or on SoundCloud? That always does me such a huge favor. It boosts my sort of relevancy if people are starting to like and watch and subscribe. And I've gotten so many new subscribers, so thank you so much. Cannot thank you enough. I noticed that my subscriptions and follows went up in the past week. So if you're just discovering me, I'm so happy you're here. And don't forget to keep PVD weird.